This is Jerry Fry, audio historian at Pacific Pioneer Broadcasters. The following is the professional history of a PPB member told by himself in his own fashion on February the 1st of 2010. These interviews are being recorded in order to compile firsthand our living history of the members of our organization and the stories of their professional experiences. Many of our members began in what is called the golden age of radio and television, and this is an attempt to preserve as much data as possible for succeeding generations. This recording is not intended for broadcast without first obtaining permission from Pacific Pioneer Broadcasters. With me today in Toluca Lake, California is Larry VANDERVEEN, a gentleman that I've had the pleasure of serving with on the board of directors of Pacific Pioneer Broadcasters, and a man who has at least one claim to fame because I found his DVD on Amazon.com the other day, a performance of a one-man show called Meeting F. Scott Fitzgerald. I know about that. But let's come back to that later on and start at the very beginning of your life, Larry. Tell us a little bit about where you were born and your early childhood.
Long way back, Jerry, but I'll work the memory as well as I can.
Good.
Mill Valley, California.
Really?
Yeah. Raised in the Oakland area. Went to Oakland High School. Got involved in radio and acting even then. I guess my first on-air experience came out of the high school years. I won a contest, a citywide contest called I Speak for Democracy.
I remember that.
You do?
Mm-hmm.
And you had to write a speech saying what you thought about democracy and why you spoke for it. And we had 6 high schools in the city, and I was lucky enough to be selected the winner among the 6. And the prize for that was to appear with the speech on a local radio station. The memory is dim a little bit here. KLX, the top of the Tribune Tower in Oakland in those years, was the station that first was involved with that. I think that's the one where we did the broadcast. And then later, KROW, which was, I think it was 960, 5,000 watt regional station in the San Francisco Bay Area, still in high school. Another contest, the prize for that was to narrate the Christmas concert in the lobby of the Central Bank on Broadway in Oakland, California, which would be broadcast on KROW.
Uh-huh.
And at that time, the morning team was composed of a guy named Don Sherwood.
I remember him.
Yeah,
too.
very, very legendary San Francisco broadcaster.
Sure.
And Ray Yeager, if I remember Ray's name correctly. And they did a morning show called Nick and Nude Nick. And Don was Nude Nick.
Nude Nick, yeah, I'll bet he was.
And, yeah.
I know what he would name.
Yeah, he was quite a rebel. Anyway, they sent him down to chaperone the kid and for the live broadcast. I guess we did it live at the bank, and probably it aired live. I can't remember that, but I know he took me to lunch after. And we were halfway through the lunch. He said, "Well, kid, you want to be a radio announcer, is that right?" I said, "Yes, sir, Mr. Sherwood, I really do." And he said, "Well, don't do it." I said, "Why?" And he said, "Well, I'm not 30 yet. I've been fired off every station in California, married and divorced 4 times. It's a lousy business." So I got a lot of encouragement early.
Isn't that funny?
Yeah, he was a great guy. But anyway, that's where my association with broadcasting started, really. And then...
Did your mother and father, were they in any kind of show business?
No, nothing. My dad was a printer. My mother was a homemaker. So it just, I guess, happenstance. That's something I really fell in love with early.
Did you have siblings?
Sister, a great singer, but never professionally.
Uh-huh.
But, you know, you talk about the golden age of radio, and as I was a kid, I would listen to Lanny Ross. Remember Lanny Ross?
Sure.
On a big Philco, top
console
line
radio.
console radio set that we had in those days. And I think I must have been 4 or 5 years old, but listening to Lanny Ross just made me think, boy, that's fun. It would be fun to be on radio. And I don't know whether that was subliminal or really literal, but I suppose my interest was that early. And then when I got out of high school, I had a scholarship to St. Mary's College in Moraga for speech, and I didn't take it. Not too bright on my part. I ended up instead going into the Army, volunteered for the draft during the Korean War, very end of the Korean War. Still on, but I got lucky and they sent me to Germany. by one name on the list at the end of basic training. So I had the gods on my side at that time.
Sure did.
But even luckier, because when I got over there, without trying to make it happen, I ended up in special services, entertainment. In fact, did a series of broadcasts on AFN in Germany.
In Frankfurt?
No, they were different than that. I wasn't part of AFN. They were live creative variety show, production variety show I called Holiday for a Star. And I sold it to AFN. And but I'll get there in a minute. I guess I leapfrogged a little bit.
Where were you stationed in Germany?
Beginning in Stuttgart. And the AFN station in Stuttgart is where we developed this thing.
Right.
But that all began because before I went into the Army, I was not yet 19, and I was doing a play at a community theater in Alameda, California, up by Oakland. And after one of the rehearsals, the director came over to me, a guy who became, and was even then, a successful character actor down here named Ed O'Brien, but I didn't really know that at the time. But he said to me, "I hear you're going in the Army after the show." I said, "Yes, I am." He said, "Well, put out your hand." And I did, and he put a penny in it. I said, "What's that for?" And he said, "Well, I'm your director, right?" He said, "Yeah, you're acting in my show, right? Well, I just paid you, so now you're a professional actor." So when you go into the Army, they'll give you a thing called the 201 file. You tell them what you did, among other things, as a profession in your civilian life. So you tell them you were an actor. That seemed pretty silly, but I did it, and lo and behold, long story short, it paid off because a colonel that I was working for as a private saw that, ended up asking me to direct the American Dependence Theater next production at the Stuttgart Opera House, German Opera House, and I did, and I cast myself in the lead, which was a good directing, you know.
Sure.
Anyway, that led to the decision to do this variety show I was telling you about. I thought it would be a fun thing to do. At that time, AFN, and you would know, was not doing any live production broadcasts, not in Germany. They were taking transcriptions from the States and doing local disc jockey shows and that sort of thing. So
what year would this have been?
It would be 1954, early in 54. So we created a show called Holiday for a Star, and we did it in all of the AFN cities, Nuremberg, Munich, Stuttgart. I don't remember if we did in Frankfurt. We did 26 shows once a week live. With a band and a girl singer from England and a boy singer from the Army, and GIs being the contestants in the quiz show. So that was the next introduction to radio was in the Army, and that was a lot of fun and did well, and that was all over, and I came back from to the States. I actually also did Born Yesterday, touring with the 7th Army Repertory Company in Germany just before that radio show. You'll remember Frank Gorshin, the impressionist.
Oh yeah, sure.
Frank was in that show, and a lot of people that Buck Henry that did a lot of things here well in the business later. But
in those days, 7th Army had a real powerhouse organization there. You had a symphony orchestra.
Yes, they did.
A fantastic symphony.
Yeah, it was quite an entertainment vehicle, and it was great to be part of it. They toured musicals, variety shows, straight plays, which I did, and the radio show, which I did. Was a 7th Army Special Service production aired by AFN. So I wasn't on the AFN staff, but I did a show for AFN.
Right.
So when I came home, I sold myself a show on KROW again called, I don't know, Night with Larry or Life with Larry or something like that. And we used to broker or barter time in those days, as you know. And I went out and sold 33 Foster's Freeze Softies ice cream stands, $10 a piece, to get the $300 and some to buy the hour for the show. And convinced them that since the show would involve me bringing high schools in each week, well, I'd sell a lot of Softies ice cream for them. Right?
Sure.
We didn't sell any ice cream cones, but we didn't last too long. But that was another radio experience. And so I moved along and came down here to Los Angeles to do some acting, try to do that. And I worked on the air at KUTE-FM in those days, which was a small storefront FM station in Glendale.
Really?
And, maybe I was in the wrong business because back at KROW, you remember Dick Whittington also.
Sure.
when I was there doing that radio show that I sold for myself, they'd call me in to do relief things now and then. And Dick Whittington was the midday man on KROW. Mm-hmm. He was 27, I think, and I was 22 or 3 or something like that. I was the kid. And one day they called me in to do the noon hour news, and in Dick's show we had a double console. He was on the other side of the newsman with his mic, and then my mic on this side. I'd never done a news broadcast in my life. So it was rip and read, took the news off the wire. Came in and sat down, and Dick said, well, Dick, talk about Don Sherwood being a rebel. Dick was trained by Don Sherwood to be a rebel, and they were both rebels, but great talents. So Dick sat down, or rather he was behind the mic in a show, and he said, well, it's now time for the noon hour news, and with Larry VANDERVEEN. I said, thank you, Dick, and off I went. Here's the noon hour news brought to you by Montgomery Ward, and Dick was sitting on the other side looking at me with this Cheshire Cat grin, all the way through this 5-minute newscast, and I couldn't figure out what was going on. I finished the newscast, and I said, well, now back to the Dick Whittington show. And I got up to leave, and Dick said, Larry, come back here for a minute, please. Please come back here. And I said, well, what is it, Dick? And he said, I want you to sit down there. I want you to sit right there for a minute. I want everybody to hear this. And I said, what is it? He said, I've been in this business several years now, and I want you to know that's one of the best newscasts I've ever heard. And I said, well, I said, thank you, Dick, very much. He said, yes, it was so good, Larry, that if I were you, the next time you do it, I'd turn on the mic. I'd open the mic. I had not. And this is high noon on a Friday at a 5,000-watt radio station in a major market, and anybody in the station, general manager down, came in to find out what was going on.
Good heavens.
Yeah, I must have been being heard over his mic in kind of a barrel, but it was not life's greatest moment.
Oh, my goodness.
And that was followed by when I went to KUTE-FM a few years later, and as I told you, it was a storefront FM in a time when nobody wanted to own an FM station.
No, what were they programming on FM in those days?
Just basic background music and, Sinatra stuff, but it was really just as simple as it could be, because who was listening?
Sure.
And you couldn't sell advertising, but the guy that owned the station was kind of an eccentric himself, and he carried around this big cardboard suitcase with letters from listeners that went back 10 years, and it took 10 years to get enough of them to fill up the suitcase so he could go to the advertising agencies and pop it open on their desk with the media buyer and say, look at the listeners to KUTE, which later was bought by KMPC and did very well. But on this particular occasion, because I was alone at night in the station, there was no engineer, just me, and the staff were gone, what staff there was, and I put on a long record and went back to the restroom. And then I went out to my car to get something and forgot that I had left the lock on the station door in lock position and locked myself out.
Oh, dear.
The record is going along inside, and I'm not there. Nobody's there, and it's going to wind down. I got in my car, and I listened until finally the record just quit rolling, and there was the sound of a turntable going around and around and around. And the owner was a guy who listened day and night to his station, and he came roaring down from where he lived. And I guess it took him 20 minutes to get there, opened it up, and I didn't last too long at that job. So
how embarrassing that is.
Oh, yeah. So, radio and I were good friends in a way, but in another way we didn't get the things done we wanted to do. And then...
did you ever get back to college? You never...
No, I decided, another bright move on my part, and I guess that's another one of those moments in life. I had my 15 seconds of near fame when Warner Brothers almost signed me to a contract, and in those years, a guy named William Orr, was head of Warner Brothers Television. He'd married one of the Warner daughters, I think, and he ended up not an actor anymore, but now head of the studio. Mm-hmm. And I'd gotten to a point where he was auditioning me for a possible contract, and I sat down, and it was a 2-minute scene with a young lady who was kind enough to do it with me, and his office was like a bowling alley, and I was in the back, and he was 30 feet away at his desk. And we got about 30 seconds into the scene, and the picture on the wall crashed down and hit me on the head like somebody pressed a button under his desk to get rid of this guy. They probably did, because the contract never occurred.
Never occurred.
So time went on, and I did end up stay in broadcasting for the rest of my life. Moved over into management. Was an account executive at KFWB when Westinghouse bought it in '67, if I remember. Then went to...
it had been what, Warner Brothers before that?
Yeah, KFWB.
Right.
And then I was a local sales manager at KGIL. and general sales manager at KFI. And then I left and formed my own radio production company called Radio Arts. It was in the days of automation systems. You remember the automation systems used a lot by FMs to keep programming costs down in those days when they still didn't have a lot of audience, but they were coming along. We programmed, I guess, 300 stations over the dozen or so years I kept the company. We did feature broadcasts and series. The one I enjoyed most was the recreation of Your Hit Parade with Andre Baruch and B. Wayne.
Oh, yeah.
We did 175 episodes. Andre would write the script, and he and B would co-host it, and we'd pick a year as Your Hit Parade did. And they'd kind of almanac it between records, in week of July 7, 1948, the number 7 song was, and this was what was happening in the world at the time. And
very, very interesting format.
yeah, they made a real good success out of it. We had more than 100 stations carrying it for a good long time. But we did other things, music formats and so on. I did some announcing then too, and created a television show of my own called Turning Point. I've always been fascinated by those turning points we have in our lives that we're not really aware of most of the time, and how one or more of them become very significant as we move on through life. And particularly for personalities, celebrities, I always thought it fascinating how they became what they became, how they entered show business, how they reached stardom. So we did 26 episodes that aired on KDOC. Pat Boone owned the station then. I don't know if he still does, and he's one of the guests of that series, in fact. But it was a 3-camera show, no budget to speak of, so it was live on tape. We didn't do any editing. What we got, we got. We were essentially live.
Sure.
But Milton Berle, Betty White, Tom Bosley, Dennis Weaver, just a whole series of good actors and actresses, as we called them in those days, and singer Shirley Jones did the show, and we had a lot of fun with it. We'd start by tracking the turning point in their life, maybe early on, maybe unrecognized at the time as a turning point, that ultimately led them to show business and then stardom, and then we'd do the stills and clips of their career to wind it up. That was pretty successful. We didn't syndicate it, but I found that somebody else did, and I didn't know about it. I was talking to some friends at a party at one time after the show was finished, and they said, gee, we were Gal and her husband, they were entertainers. We were in Indianapolis, I think it was, and we were staying in the hotel for the night and having dinner in the room. We turned on the television and said, it was sure fun to see you and your show Turning Point, and have an old friend in the room with us. And I said, that's pretty interesting, because I didn't know that it was syndicated, except that when I went to go get the masters from the station, they weren't there anymore. So somebody had gotten some benefit out of that beyond what we did here in L.A., but it was fun to do. Then
how can they do that? How can they pick up your property?
I think they just did a thing they thought they could get away with. They grabbed the tapes, I suppose, whoever they were, and
you never found out who that was?
Never did. I have my suspicions, but don't know for sure.
Oh,
and then they just made a deal with some syndicator to syndicate them as their property, and I guess they got away with it.
For heaven's sake!
But those things happen. Then, let's see, that was while I was still owning and operating Radio Arts, the production company. And then I began to do some more acting, which I still do as time went on. I also had a daughter who developed leukemia when I was at KFI, and she was 3 years and 10 months old. In those years, which were pretty far back, that was 72, less than half the kids were surviving. Thank God she did. But we created a mechanism for raising money for research called the National Leukemia Broadcast Council, NLBC, 501c3 charity. And we did radiothons and telethons for a lot of years for the Leukemia Society of America, and I think that produced over $80 million at last count, which is not...
Wonderful.
That's good, but it's really a drop in the bucket over the years we did it, and concerning regarding the time that is needed, or the dollars that are needed to make that disease go away, it was not a big contribution.
Yeah.
But it was worth doing, and thank God she survived, and we're pleased with that. But many of the Pacific Pioneer broadcasters, celebrity members and others, made that all possible for us. Monty Hall, Peter Marshall, Chuck Southcott, B. Wayne, Andre Baruch, Ralph Edwards, and just I could go on with names who appeared in the broadcast, both radio and television, and helped in many other ways, and that was a rewarding thing to do, and hopefully made a little difference in the fight against leukemia. Not, I suppose, a major one, but a little bit. And then I guess we're pretty much up to date. I still do voiceovers of my own, and I act, as I said. I did a Christmas show that aired on the Hallmark Channel this last Christmas called Christmas at Cadillac Jack's, where I appropriately played an old-time, small-town disc jockey who became the unwitting narrator of the story that was unfolding. And it was kind of an our town thing with a narrator who didn't know he was, in this case, the narrator, the DJ from his studio. And that was a fun show to do. And as you mentioned earlier, I'm doing the one-man play I wrote called Meeting F. Scott Fitzgerald.
Now, how did that come about?
Well, it came about because I was talking one day to a friend who'd been a writer of my show in Germany in the Army, and we remained friends over the years, and he became a very successful writer here. And I said, I'd like to do some more acting. I haven't for a while. And he said, why don't you do a one-man show? And I said, well, who should I do? And he said, you should do F. Scott Fitzgerald. And I said, why? And he said, because he was blonde, skinny, and emaciated looking like you are. That was a good old friend of mine.
Yeah.
But that's really what happened, and he'll deny that, but that's pretty much how it came about. So then I began to research Fitzgerald and found he was a very interesting guy, a great artist, great writer. And had a wonderful story. He and his wife Zelda were quite a pair. So I wrote the play and began to perform it, and do now. In fact, I just got an interesting email from Weatherford College outside of Fort Worth in Texas. I'd never heard of this, but they have a grant from the National Endowment for the Arts to present something called, it's a project of the National Endowment for the Arts called The Big Read, where for an entire month the community, engineered and directed by, in this case, Weatherford College, I think I have the name of the college right, reads together a particular book selected among 31 as acceptable for the grant, accepted as acceptable by the National Endowment for the Arts. And that book for this college is The Great Gatsby this time. And the whole community gets involved. It's kind of a rolling event. They do, the college sponsors a Charleston dance one night to reflect the era of Fitzgerald. They all read the book together or separately, and then come together in groups around the county and talk about the book. The library gets involved. It's a pretty interesting thing. So since they're doing Gatsby, and since they had seen, as you did, the DVD of my play, Meeting F. Scott Fitzgerald, on Amazon in their research, they asked me to come back and do that as part of the Endowment for the Arts project, which is going to be fun to do. So I do it on basically one-nighters, not like that usually, but more locally in the LA area.
Sure. Well, the bit you did for the board that time was really enticing.
Oh, thank you.
Beautifully done.
Fun to do, just a little slice of it.
Well, you got married someplace in your life. How did that happen?
Married my wife Sheila in '63. We have 3 daughters, all doing happily well, and as I told you, one of them, the middle daughter, had leukemia, and she's doing fine. And all of us live in the Los Angeles area, so we get to see each other. We've added 2 grandchildren and 2 more on the way. So the family has grown a bit.
Yeah. Was your wife involved with showbiz at all?
Not at all. Not at all. And she's helpful when I do
How
things.
did you meet?
Well, that's kind of a radio story too, because I was at KUTE, as I told you, the FM station, doing the night show. And it was during the period, this would be '62 probably, when thalidomide, the drug, had been causing some health problems. And I was doing the news, and as I said before, these newscasts I did were rip and read, so I had the news copy and went into the newscast, and I was talking about the thalidomide story, but I pronounced it thalidomide.
Uh-huh.
So the phone rang a few minutes after that, and nobody there to answer it but me, the entire staff of the station. Mm-hmm. So while the record was on, I picked up the phone and I said hello, and the voice was a male voice, and they said, "Are you the announcer on duty right now?" I said, "Yes, I am." And they said, "Well, gee, we thought you should know." I said, I'm a doctor, and you just pronounced thalidomide as thalidomide in your newscast." And I said, "Oh, well, gee, gosh, thank you very much. I appreciate that." Hung up the phone. A little while later, middle of another record, maybe 3 minutes later, the phone rang again. We didn't get many phone calls. And I picked up the phone, and this female voice said, "Are you the announcer?" And I said, "Yes, I am." And she said, "Well, I'm a college professor, and I was listening to the show, and I just heard you pronounce thalidomide as thalidomide, and I thought you should know." And I said, "Oh, well, thank you very much." I hung up the phone. A few minutes later, the phone rang again, and this female voice said, "Are you the announcer?" And I said, "Yes, I am." And she said, "Well, I'm a nurse." And I said, "I know. I pronounced thalidomide, thank you," and hung up, and that was my future wife.
Oh, it was?
Right. We met at a party the next week, and she was introduced as the nurse, which of course she was not. And it was a group of friends who were gathered together, and the guy that called, or I guess it was him, but the guy set me up, a friend. They had her playing bridge in his apartment, and they were listening to the show, and one at a time they called up with this story, and until I'd had all I could take.
Oh, for heaven's sake! None of the calls was genuine.
None were genuine. They were all rigged. And so when I saw her, or was introduced to her a week later at a party, and we remembered and talked about that meeting, it was not a propitious meeting, and it wasn't a good start, but it ended up all right.
My goodness gracious!
Yeah.
Well, I've heard of thalidomide babies, but I've never heard of a thalidomide wife before.
You have now.
Good heavens!
Yeah, that was kind of an interesting get together.
Well, your background and mine are kind of parallel in a lot of areas. When I went to basic training at Fort Ord, and they asked me,
that's where I was, Fort Ord.
They asked me what I had been doing in life, and I said I was a radio announcer. They put me down as such, and of course I ended up being assigned as a radio operator. That is, an infantry operator with a radio on my back, running up and down mountains.
Oh, no kidding. Oh.
Communications type.
Oh, that's rough duty.
But I was supposed to go to Korea, but fate intervened, and I came down, as many of us did, with pneumonia after my
Fort Ord crud, we used to call
crud. So you had to make it to the fourth week, or you'd have to go back and start over again. So with 105 fever, I was out on the firing range and determined to get through that sucker, which I did. Shot sharpshooter somehow. I don't know how. Couldn't see the target very well. But anyway, ended up in the hospital there for 7 weeks, and in the meantime had made contact with the public affairs officer at the base, and he told me about his friend who ran the public affairs office, then called Public Information Office, in Würzburg, Germany, for the 10th Division. So he said, "If you like, I'll write him a letter, tell him, see if we can get you assigned." I said, "I sure would appreciate that. I'd rather go to Germany than Korea."
Yes, sir.
Ended up there and worked the next 18 months out of Würzburg, but did, as you did, work for AFN without actually being assigned.
When was that?
This is 1956 and 57 and 50. Late 56 into 57 and early 58.
You were starting when I came home then. I came home in June of 56.
Just about that.
And I got the Fort Ord crud, we called it too, and I went into the hospital during basic training as well.
I'll be darned.
And I remember I was still in the reception center. I hadn't been assigned to a unit yet.
At all.
And I remember looking out the window of my bed in the hospital, or what they called it, I think the infirmary or something in those days. But anyway, I'd see the units going by every day, marching, doing their training.
Yep.
One particular outfit was always running, double timing.
Sure.
And I asked the WACs, as they were then, the nurse, Women's Army Corps, I asked her, why was that? Why were the others marching and that one running all the time? She said, well, that's the Flying 63rd. They called it the Flying 63rd because the CO won't allow any of his soldiers to march anywhere. They must run everywhere. You don't want to get assigned to the Flying 63rd.
No.
So, of course, I got assigned to the Flying 63rd.
Oh, my gosh.
But we were up on the hill, the barracks up on the hill.
Yeah, the new ones?
The old ones. They hadn't new ones yet.
Oh, they hadn't.
Because this would be April of 53,
3.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And we'd run 3 miles down to the beach for the rifle range every day, as you did also.
Yep.
Crawl through that gunk and the sand and everything else.
And then sit in the bleachers while the cold air came in off the ocean and you were wringing wet with sweat.
That's how you got it. Yeah.
That's how you got it.
Yeah.
Oh, my goodness.
Well, it's interesting. Small world, huh?
Yeah, very small world. But it was the best 2 years of my life, looking back on it.
Yeah, me too. It was a wonderful time. Yeah.
Really wonderful experience. But the when I was in the hospital, that's my first experience with Armed Forces Radio, because they had a bedpan network. They called it a bedpan network, and an actual studio, control room with records and everything. So I went down there and did some volunteer work while I was actually in convalescent status.
Oh, yeah?
And that was my first experience looking at a record that had a label on it saying Armed Forces Radio Service.
You know, we replaced, with Holiday for a Star, the show I told you about, we replaced Paul Whiteman, who was on AFN every Friday night at 8.
Yeah.
And, you know, remember they'd fly over the transcriptions from the States?
Yep.
And that was the pitch I made when I went up to Frankfurt to try to sell the show. I said, you know, you guys aren't doing any production shows at all. Why don't you do this one we call Holiday for a Star? And we had created the demo at the studios in Stuttgart, at the AFN station in Stuttgart. And I asked a guy named Ed Knowles, staff sergeant, career guy at the time, I said, if you can get me into the station to do the demo, I'll make you my Don Wilson. You can be the you can be the announcer in the show. And he said, oh, that'd be great. So we did. And we got a Bing Crosby record for the boy singer and a Doris Day record at the time for the girl singer, and probably the Les Brown band to be the band. And then I wrote the sketches, and we dummied up it was a famous persons, famous places, famous events format, where a GI would come out of the audience cold and read a sketch with the cast, who were all amateurs but actors, and he was not.
Yeah.
So he'd louse it up because it was a cold reading, and he'd stumble and get in trouble, and that'd be terrible.
Sure.
And then that would be maybe famous places, and then another GI would come up and we'd do famous persons, and then so on. And by the time the 3 were over, and a few band numbers, songs had been inserted, we'd ask the audience for an applause meter by hand, you know, which one of them did the best and therefore became a star and therefore earned a holiday for a star. And we sent them to Berchtesgaden.
Oh, gee, yeah.
Where I ended up emceeing the floor show.
Oh, you did?
Yeah.
That was a beautiful place, wasn't it?
Oh, Bavaria is just magnificent.
The history of that place was unbelievable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When I was there, we were still stumbling over German helmets out in the woods. It was from World War II.
Sure. Magnificent place.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I went back in 91 or 90 with my family to show them where I'd been, and we went to the General Walker Hotel. Did you ever go to the Walker?
You did, yeah.
And the Skyline Room, which was the big showroom. That's where we did our show that I emceed, and I was entertainment director there for the last year.
Oh, were you really?
And we'd bring a different European group of European acts in every month and do a show there in the Skyline Room. And the guy who was the German who was the assistant manager of the hotel in 90 or 91, as I say, I asked him if he could get into the Skyline Room and told him why, that 34 or 5 years before I'd done a show there. And he remembered the show because he'd been a bus boy in the Skyline Room 35 years earlier and used to see the show every night.
Oh, my gosh.
Yeah, so it was Old Home Week.
Sure.
Yeah, those were, we had tough duty, you and I. We had really tough duty.
Yeah, I know. But we could have had a lot tougher with just the flick of a...
Yeah. We were lucky.
I was up at Garmisch, I remember, too.
Garmisch, we toured Born Yesterday in Garmisch.
They had a beautiful place, and they had an ice show.
Yeah.
And I guess it was there I met Gary Crosby, was in the Army at that time.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah. But he wouldn't remember because he was smashed.
Yeah.
As usual.
Yeah. Yeah. There were a lot of people that came out of the entertainment end of the Army that did well professionally later.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Well, AFN has an honor roll of people who were, big stars at one time.
Yeah.
Many of them still are working, but started out in either Frankfurt or Stuttgart or one of the other affiliates all over Germany.
Right.
Steve Binder on our board was with the Blue Danube Network out of Austria.
Oh, is that right?
And then finally moved up into Germany.
I'll be done. So, I remember vaguely the Blue Danube Network. Maybe was it active at the same time?
I think it was deactivated perhaps just prior to your time.
Yeah, because I only faintly remember the name. I don't remember the network. We didn't have any association with it anyway.
And Ray de Tournay was assigned to Comsey in Orléans, France, before it closed down, and working with AFN there.
I mentioned Frank Gorshin. He was in the cast of Born Yesterday. We weren't doing AFN then. We were doing special services, plays and shows.
Mm-hmm.
And Frank, I'll never forget, at least the way I remember it, he said he was the only impressionist, the first and only ever to be able to make his face look like the character he was imitating by voice.
Absolutely.
And he always looked like Jimmy Cagney, so he didn't have any trouble with that. It was automatic.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember saying to him one night backstage when we were doing Born Yesterday, "Do you do anybody else?" And he said, "I don't know, I never tried." And he tried, and the rest was history, as they say. Boy, could he do it.
Absolutely fantastic. Yeah. The early days of television when he was on, it was so amazing to see a person who could actually, like you say, look like the person that they were impersonating.
It's a funny story for me anyway. I went to see him in a Broadway play. This would be 30 years ago. And alone, and I was sitting in the theater watching, and I said, "Boy, I can't believe it. Even I, who know Gorshin so well and know what he does with his face, if I didn't know it, looking at him up there, I would not believe that was Frank Gorshin. It's just an amazing transition."
Yeah.
So at intermission, I went out in the lobby and I asked, wrote on the back of my business card to get Frank send it to his dressing room. And the lady in the lobby said to me, "Oh, he's not in the show tonight. That's a substitute that's out there."
Oh, no wonder you didn't recognize him.
I thought I was looking at Frank and amazed at what he could do, even more than I'd ever seen before.
Yeah.
But he was one of those extra special talents. He got discovered over there in a way that rivals and probably surpasses the story of Lana Turner at Schwab's drugstore. Being discovered there. There was a weapons testing area on the Czech border, Grafenweer.
Grafenweer, sure.
You remember it?
Been there.
You were?
Mm-hmm.
Well, they asked us in our tour, we had girls from London, England, who would do the female parts, and we were touring Born Yesterday. And we'd take a deuce-and-a-half truck, as we called them in those days, and put the flats and the props in and the costumes, and then two if we needed, and then a bus for us, the cast, and crew to roll around Germany like a show on the road. And we'd stop at various bases and entertain, and either stay there overnight and move on to the next one the next day, or we'd just leave after the show and go to the next one. Well, this particular night, Frank had just gotten, we went to Grafenweer, and civilians weren't allowed in at that time. It was the height of the Cold War, and Bob Hope and like never went to Grafenweer, so they got us, the GIs, the soldiers there were entertained by us.
Right.
And we got off the bus, and the drill would be we usually go to the theater and set up the show, then we go to the mess hall for chow, and then we go back and do the show, and then what I told you before would ensue.
Mm-hmm.
We got off the bus, and Frank said to me, for reasons I don't know because I wasn't in charge of anything, but he said, "Larry, do you mind if I go to the service club for a while and relax, and I'll meet you guys at the show?" And I was, "Sure, Frank." So we went off and set up the show and had chow, and then went to the stage. Well, turns out Frank had just gotten a Dear John letter from a girl in Pittsburgh, where he was from, named Carlotta.
Oh.
And he was just crushed. And he had written a ballad called Carlotta that he could record it on the piano, he could play and sing, and that he could cry over. While he got over her, he could go play the Carlotta, right?
Yeah.
And sing. So that's what he wanted to do. So he went, he went to the service club alone, nobody there, sat down at the piano, started to play Carlotta and cry. And while he was doing that, a lone GI who was coming in from maneuvers, he'd been out in the field for maybe a month, beat up and steel pot dirty and exhausted, and he was cutting through the service club to go to his barracks to flop out, relax. But as he came in, he heard Frank.
Uh-huh.
So he sat down on the couch and stacked his rifle, took off his pack and helmet, and listened. And Frank decided to do his one-man show for him, the whole show. Lo and behold, appears this guy in his mid-40s in a three-piece suit and tie, leaning against the door jamb to the service club area that Frank was in. How, to this day, I don't know he got there. I don't know why he was there. But Frank finishes his show, and this guy listened to the show with the GI. And then this fellow walked over to Frank, and he said, "When are you getting out of the Army?" And he said, "In 3 weeks." And he said, "Well, when you get to New York, come see me." And he put his card on the piano as a Universal Pictures talent scout. out of nowhere in a weapons testing area on the Czech border where he probably shouldn't have been. Maybe he had a son that was there or something.
Yeah.
But Frank did. He went to see him, and 2 weeks after that, he was in the Virgin Islands on the Proud and the Profane with Bill Holden and Thelma Ritter.
Oh, for heaven's sake.
And he never stopped working.
Oh, gee.
But he'd have been found anyway. He was one of the greats.
Indeed.
Yeah, and it's a nice thing about our business. We get to see the real talent grow around when we're there and enjoy it.
Was he in the Batman TV
series?
Yes,
he was the
movies.
You know, he was in this TV series. He was the Riddler. He was the Riddler.
That's right.
Cesar Romero was the Joker.
Yeah.
Adam West was Batman, and that's his biggest claim to fame, I think.
Mm-hmm.
At least television made a lot of people household names that even film didn't in some times in those days.
I went to college with Adam West, whose real name was Bill Anderson.
Is that right?
And he couldn't act his way out of a paper bag.
Yeah.
We were in a lot of acting classes together, and he was awful.
Whatever he was, it paid off.
It paid off. He had chutzpah.
Yeah, that's what it takes.
That's what it takes.
Yeah.
My Gravender story was, I was there, I used to go around with my portable recorders and interview GIs for hometown release on their radio station in their hometown for Mother's Day or Christmas or New Year's or whatever it would be. So I went up to Grafender one time and was talking with GIs and do about a 3-minute bit, and I sent them back to the Army Hometown News Center. And this one kid came up and he was very nervous about doing this. And I said, just relax, and it's very informal. We're just going to chat, and this is Mother's Day. And at the end, wish your mother a happy Mother's Day. He said, well, I don't want her to know about my girlfriend. I said, okay. Well, you have a German girlfriend? Yeah, I don't want to know about it. I said, well, I'm not going to tell her.
Yeah.
So, don't worry about it. When we come to the end, just say Happy Mother's Day. So he mumbles along about stuff and things, and he gets to the end of this thing, and he says, and Mom, he says, I don't want you to worry about my girlfriend. She's going to be all right as soon as the baby comes. And I just sat there.
That's funny.
I sat there dumbfounded.
Yeah. You had his scoop anyway.
Yeah. So I didn't know whether I should edit that out or he didn't say I should.
The funny things that happen in this business, I told you already about the Dick Whittington thing where I didn't open the mic, and I told you about locking myself out of the radio station. I told you about the picture falling on my head when I was auditioning for Warner Brothers. There's one event after the other. The one I left out, which really matches up with all of them. The days of per inquiry advertising.
Oh, yeah, sure.
And before cable television networks, there were superstations, if you recall. Mm-hmm. And WGN in Chicago was the TV superstation, meaning that its signal went everywhere.
Yep.
They had 20 million listeners, cumulative listeners a week. And a friend of mine is a great composer. He said, he did the score for the Pink Panther television series. Mm-hmm. And he and another friend who was a documentary producer were talking about this idea. And they said, why don't we do an album of the music from the Pink Panther, the Christmas music from the Pink Panther television series? Mm-hmm. And do a television commercial, because Larry, you said you know something about this PI advertising, per inquiry advertising. I said, yeah, I'd probably get that on the air somewhere, maybe even WGN, because that's, they reach the nation. It would be before 20 million listeners with a schedule of spots. Yeah. And they said, all right, well, let's do it. I did it was a television spot, so I did the on-camera stuff, and we did the filming in the studio of this fellow who was a documentary filmmaker. And I got it on WGN. I think we had 18 spots a week for 2 weeks, maybe not that. It doesn't matter. We had a pretty good schedule. We had 20 million viewers. We sold one album, one album in the whole nation, and that one was returned. So another zero.
Another zero.
Yeah. So I don't know what I'm doing in this business, to tell you the truth.
Your last employment in radio was when?
On the station side, on air?
Yeah.
Would have been in 75. Then I formed my own production company, and that went through to 88 or something. Okay. I did a lot of voiceover stuff there, and then I still do bits here and there. and I still am the broadcast consultant for the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society.
Good.
Do a annual radiothon with Rush Limbaugh, who is just magnificent. Whatever anybody's politics are doesn't matter, because he's a good guy. He gives us his audience power is remarkable. Talk about radio and what a personality can do with an audience, or how he can build an audience out of a raw talent, and that's what Rush has, just natural raw talent.
Absolutely.
He has, now I think the latest numbers are 14 million listeners a week, but when we do the radiothon will be our 20th year this April, big celebration for his 20 years of fighting leukemia. He does it on a Friday. He calls the broadcast Open Line Friday, when the subject can be whatever the callers want it to be. And he sprinkles our appeal through the 3-hour show. So we may get an hour's airtime at best. There's no advance fundraising, which is typical for radio and telethons. They go out and raise money before the broadcast, or they have money to put on the board right away, and it adds to what the callers add to the pre-fundraising.
Yeah.
But none of that. Rush does none of that. It's all at the moment, whatever he gets at the moment. Last year he did $3 million for us in an hour's airtime. He's raised a total of $21 million, I think the latest number is, and he gives $300,000 as his own pledge. He has nothing to do with the illness, no experience in family or friends that I know of, and he's just, at the same time, he has a hearing problem he has to fight on his own, and he gets out there and battles and uses radio in probably the most magnificent way possible. You know, it's a great vehicle for entertainment, and that's an important thing to do. It's a great vehicle for news and information, that's equally important. But it's probably at its best when it's helping other people. And there's no better example of radio helping other people than when Rush Limbaugh does his Leukemia and Lymphoma Society radiothon. We call it a Curathon. Every April, maybe early May this year. And it's a magnificent thing to be part of, a wonderful thing to see happen. And so I suppose when you say your last experience with radio, it would be ongoing.
Sure,
because that's radio.
Right. No, I've heard him do those curathons.
You have?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and he's always very impassioned about it.
He sure is.
Yeah, it's wonderful to have people like that.
Yeah.
Have we covered the life of Larry VANDERVEEN?
There's some left, I guess, but we don't know what that's going to be yet.
No, that's right. After that, we'll come back for it with an addendum.
Right. Jerry, nice to talk with you.
Nice talking with you. Larry VANDERVEEN is a member of the board of directors of the Pacific Pioneer Broadcasters, and we've been exploring his life for the past few minutes. My name is Jerry Fry. I'm the audio historian of PPB, and we thank you very much for listening to this.